All right. Excuse me. Thank you, everyone. Good morning, and thank you for listening to the presentations thus far and listening to this one. So this is going to be the last session before we jump into a Q&A. So again, my name is Joseph Kotsybar. I'm a Regulatory Health Project Manager in ORS OGD, and I'll be covering today my presentation on the overview of the FDA Product-Specific Guidance Program, otherwise or betterly known as PSGs. So what we'll cover today is we'll go through the PSG background. We'll talk about the relation to the FDA's ANDA program. We'll cover an overview of the FDA PSG program as a whole, talk through the GDUFA III commitments, and talk through public comments and public requests. And then lastly, we'll end with discussing PSG teleconferences, or T-Cons, and other PSG meetings. So to start, we'll start with the basics. What is a product-specific guidance? So this term has been used a few times through the presentations this morning. Product-specific guidances are a great way to start with your generic drug development. So very, very similar to how the FDA publishes general guidances for industry, they also publish these product-specific guidances, which these are going to reflect the FDA's current thinking and expectations on how to develop a generic drug product that is therapeutically equivalent to a specific RLD, or reference listed drug. These guidances, of course, as their names, contain product-specific recommendations to help identify the methods for developing generic drugs and generate the evidence needed to support ANDA approval. They are going to include key science and research outputs, and they're very unique to the generic drug development program. So when we think about establishing bioequivalence for a current drug product, you can't solely rely on PSGs. They're a great resource, and I'll highly recommend them every time. But of course, you need to also look into the regulations in 21 CFR, as well as these other general guidances I just mentioned on the previous slide. All three of these approaches used together can really help paint the picture for how to show your product is bioequivalent to the innovator, or RLD. PSGs also play a very unique and integral part in the FDA's ANDA program. So when we think about the pre-ANDA program, there's a few pathways industry can go about talking with the FDA or receiving further guidance or recommendations from the FDA. Some of these pathways include the pre-ANDA meetings, which I believe we'll have a presentation on later today, controlled correspondences, otherwise known as CCs, and then my presentation specifically talking about these PSGs. PSGs are often developed based on GDUFA-funded research. Once they're developed, they're published into the public domain space, and then they go under a review process to where the general public, similar to other general guidances, can always comment on these and leave feedback. So this program started back in 2007. The FDA has been publishing these PSGs to provide clear and direct recommendations to ANDA applicants. You can see over time, so this is going back really to almost the beginning of GDUFA, PSGs have generally increased over time, but they show a great variance year to year. As of today, we have 2,186 PSGs posted, and actually I think there's a typo there. We just posted a standalone PSG last week, so that number is 2,187 PSGs. And we will talk about standalone PSGs here shortly. What I think is impressive though, 40% of these, or about 40%, are for complex products. This is a high number in my opinion because complex products in general require obstacles, both regulatory and scientific, in order to establish bioequivalence. So having 40% of our PSGs for complex generic products, I think is a pretty good feat for the PSG program. So now focusing on the GDUFA III commitments with PSGs. This is one of the biggest drivers, I would say, on when to expect PSGs to be developed. So for non-complex NCE new drug applications, or NDAs, approved on or after October 1st, 2022, that was the start of GDUFA III, a PSG will be issued for 90% of such NDA products within 2 years. So what does that really mean? So we are saying that if a drug product is a non-complex product and it's a NCE, so it's a new chemical entity that is a specific type of new drug application, typically going to be a type 1 approval. For all of these non-complex products, the FDA is committed to having a PSG published within 2 years of that RLD approval. So while the commitment is only 90%, really we're closer to 100%. I don't believe we actually have missed a GDUFA goal date in the past several years. So hopefully this shouldn't be too new to the folks listening in today, because this is no change from GDUFA 2. What's changed, and what's quite a big change, I would say, are for complex products. So complex products approved in NDAs, and I'll stop there because that's the first really big change. For the non-complex, it's focused on NCEs only. So this new complex commitment is going to talk about any new drug application that's been approved and considered a complex product. So for these complex NDAs, on or after, again, that October 1st, 2022, the start of GDUFA 3, a PSG will be issued for 50% of such NDAs within 2 years, 75% within 3 years. Another way to say that is essentially for any complex NDA approved after that start of GDUFA 3, the FDA is committed to 50% of those within 2 years. An additional 25% of those products will be published within 3 years. And then there's going to be a missing 25% that do not get a GDUFA commitment. Those are going to be really for products that have really challenging and high hurdles for their scientific or regulatory obstacles in order to complete the PSG. Typically, those PSGs are going to need research before bioequivalence recommendation can be established. And then, of course, for any PSGs that were for complex products approved before GDUFA 3, FDA will strive to continue those as quickly as they can. So when we think about the PSG process, it's a very cyclical process in nature. So we'll always have a pool of products we can create PSGs for. These PSGs are prioritized for development or revision into batches. They go through the development phase, which can be anywhere from months to years, depending on the complexity of the product. The PSGs will then be published, typically in quarterly batches or sometimes as standalones. And then the guidances will seek public comment, just like any other posted guidance for industry. So you may be asking, what's some of the initiating events that would lead to a PSG development? Or how do you prioritize these PSGs to be developed? Those are great questions. So this excerpt here is from the PSG snapshot available on the FDA's website. And here it has a great list of actually initiating events, prioritization factors, and data to support the PSG development. So while this is not fully all-inclusive, it's going to cover most of the factors. So some of these initiating events are going to be recently approved NDAs and supplemental NDAs, FDA internal analysis into products without PSGs, any pre-ANDA meeting requests, public requests, comments to the PSG docket, which we'll cover here in a couple slides, controlled correspondences, or citizens petitions. Now, how do we prioritize the PSGs into these batches? Well, first and foremost, the GDUFA commitment is always going to be at the top of the list. FDA is going to strive to meet those GDUFA commitments laid out in the GDUFA 3 commitment letter. Other than that, though, we do take into other considerations such as stakeholder interest via ANDA submissions, drug availability and accessibility, public requests, and public health priorities. Last but not least, there is data to support PSG development. So we use pharmacokinetic and pharmacodynamic modeling, previous bioequivalence studies, NDA review, pharmacovigilance, and of course, the GDUFA-funded research outcomes. So how do we revise our PSGs? So that previous slide was really talking about how we're going to develop a new PSG. However, PSGs will need to be revised at certain times. So again, while this list is not all-inclusive, it's going to highlight most of the reasons we would choose to revise a guidance. Some of these include changes to the RLD, such as a labeling update, supplements for a new strength, newly identified safety concerns, consistency with revision to general guidances, citizens petitions, responses received to the BE comments, new bioequivalence approaches from research, and new knowledge from ANDA assessments and pre-ANDA meetings. We do have categories that list how the PSGs will be revised. So in general, there's critical, in vivo major, and in vitro major, minor, and editorial. And you can see some brief descriptions of how those revisions are done on the side there. So when are PSGs published? So we kind of talked about this a little bit on the cycle slide, but new and revised PSGs are published quarterly in 4 batches a year. And we've gotten really good at the scheduling to where they should be fairly consistent into these 4 months. So February, May, August, and November are going to be the 4 months we would typically be posting these batches of guidances. A PSG may be published, though, as a standalone guidance or standalone batch outside the quarterly publications. So again, just like that PSG we posted last week, this would fall into this category as a standalone posting. So a couple of these reasons why we would post a standalone guidance would be to coordinate with a CP response, to meet the GDUFA goal date, efficiency in developing PSGs for the same product in the same class. I believe this was last done with the topical batch of PSGs that was posted in late 2022, and a level 2 revision. The FDA is going to issue a notice in the Federal Registrar for every batch and standalone posting, except a level 2 revision. So you may be asking, why not a level 2 revision? What's special about a level 2 revision? So first, you kind of have to understand what a level 1 revision is. So level 1 revision would be how we typically think about how the PSGs are revised. It's going to describe a change in FDA's earlier interpretation or policy that are more than a minor in nature. A level 2 PSG revision is going to be strictly typographical errors found in the PSGs. There's never going to be a change in the bioequivalence recommendation or the agency thinking. So for the first time in late 2023, last year, we revised 3 PSGs through this level 2 revision process. So one of the best resources other than the PSGs themselves is this upcoming PSGs for generic drug product development, otherwise known as the forecast list. This is going to describe the FDA's plans for all upcoming new and revised PSGs for generic drug products in the next 12 months. What's new with GDUFA III is this list includes complex and non-complex products. Overall, this list is going to enhance transparency in the PSG development. What's new with GDUFA III, we now list month and year on this forecast list, so applicants can have a really good understanding of the month they should expect to see that PSG published. Last but not least, we will ensure consistency in FDA recommendations and decisions following previous iterations of the PSG. So essentially what this means, we always want to list out the exact revision category and reason that the PSG is being revised. This will be very clear, hopefully to industry, what the change is going to reflect. The forecast list is updated quarterly with each batch posting. So really quick, we can take a quick look at what this forecast list looks like. So again, it's broken down into new and revised PSGs. You can see here a couple things to point out. We have that product complexity, so it's going to clearly indicate if the product is complex or non-complex. And then you can see that planned publication column where we will strive to give the closest we can to the month and year of that PSG posting. So just like other general guidances, you can also leave comments on the PSGs. So similar to other presenters this morning, the PSGs do have a special docket. So you can comment on the Federal Registrar notice through the docket number FDA 2007 D0369. The notice will identify a comment period for these recommendations once the PSGs are posted. Comments can be submitted electronically to the docket or by mail. And users can, of course, get help through the assistance on the regulations.gov support site. Overall, FDA is going to consider comments on these draft PSGs while revising the guidances. So when we think about public comments, we think about after the PSG is published, that's when industry can leave the comments. Public requests is kind of the opposite. So public requests are going to be submitted through the CDER Direct Next-Gen collaboration portal. And it's basically going to be a bioequivalence request for a product that does not have a PSG already. The FDA reviews these requests and takes appropriate action. You can see really since the beginning of GDUFA II in 2017, the public requests have significantly decreased. So I think there could be several reasons why we saw such a drastic decrease. One could potentially be just by the number of PSGs we have available. There's less products to send a public request in for. The other, I think industry has gotten better at looking at the forecast list. Using this forecast list, you can predict and see when PSGs are going to be coming out over the next year. So if you see a PSG that's going to be developed, either new or revised, you may forego submitting the public request because you know it's going to be published soon. So PSGs can be withdrawn. So typically, the PSGs are going to be withdrawn when they no longer reflect the FDA's current thinking. I would say this is most commonly due to when the RLD is withdrawn for safety or efficacy. The table shown on this slide is right on that link and right on the FDA's website. It is important to note that when a PSG is reposted, it will be removed from this withdrawn list because that guidance is no longer withdrawn. So last but not least, we'll cover PSG T-Cons and PSG Meetings. So for PSG T-Cons, this is something new that was added with GDUFA III. This meeting should be used when ANDA applicants can request a PSG T-Con at any time during their product development, either pre-submission or post-submission, when FDA publishes a new or revised guidance that introduces a revised recommendation. However, it needs to meet a couple criteria. So the recommendation has to be related to an in vivo BE study, and the ANDA applicant has already commenced that in vivo BE study that may be different from that new PSG recommendation. Prospective ANDA applicants should submit a request for the pre-submission T-Con and pre-submission PSG meeting electronically through the CDER Direct Next-Gen collaboration portal. Further, an ANDA applicant should submit a request for a post-submission PSG T-Con or post-submission PSG meeting electronically through the electronic submissions gateway. In fiscal year 2023, 2 PSG T-Con requests were received and held. So PSG meetings. So you may say, okay, how are these different than PSG T-Cons? Well, PSG meetings, either pre-submission or post-submission, can be requested following the PSG T-Con if additional discussion is still needed. So this allows a forum for scientific rationale for an approach other than the approach listed in the PSG. A pre-submission PSG meeting will be requested if the ANDA has not been submitted, and a post-submission PSG meeting will be requested if the ANDA has been already submitted. Controlled correspondences is another great pathway for applicants to follow up with the FDA on remaining issues following the PSG T-Con. And other pre-ANDA and scientific meetings are also available as an alternative to a PSG meeting. However, the caveat to this is the FDA recommends that applicants do not submit a CC and request for a meeting at the same or around the same time asking those same questions. Unfortunately, last year, FDA did not receive any PSG meeting requests. So a little update on the next SBI webinar. So this was briefly mentioned in the first session. So there is going to be an upcoming SBIA webinar strictly focused on PSGs. So if you thought this presentation was useful or interesting, this webinar would be a great next steps to go and listen to. So it is titled Facilitating Generic Drug Product Development Through PSGs. It's April 25th, 1 to 4 p.m. You can see some of the topics covered. So it will start with a really high-level presentation of the PSG program, similar to this presentation, but then really delves into the scientific content recommended in the PSGs. It'll talk through BCS waiver options, the drug-device combination section in PSGs, consideration factors for bioequivalence studies, and the dissolution methods and database. So last but not least, I do have 2 challenge questions. So the first one is, what is not one of the factors FDA takes into consideration while prioritizing PSG development or revision. We have ANDA assessment, goal dates, public health priorities, public requests, and drug availability and accessibility. I see some nods. I think so A is the correct answer. So if you selected A, you'd be right. So ANDA assessment goal dates are not one of the prioritization factors. And the last question is, what is a new feature added with the GDUFA III commitments for the upcoming PSGs for generic drug product development, otherwise known as the forecast list? Forecasting both new and revised PSGs, forecasting both non-complex and complex PSGs, forecasting specific revision reasons for revised PSGs, and updated quarterly with each PSG batch posting. So this is kind of a tricky one. Hopefully everyone selected B, forecasting both non-complex and complex PSGs. So this was just started with GDUFA III. Prior to GDUFA III, we only listed complex products on this forecast list. All right, and here are some resources where a lot of this material was taken from. And with that, I'll conclude and we can start the Q&A panel. Turn it over to Brenda. Thank you.